your attention to is the slide here, which is the Emergency Department Operations Conference we're having here in Vancouver, April 27th and 28th at the WASC Center here in Vancouver. And it's going to be the agenda we're very pleased with. It's going to be 2 days of I think, frank discussion and really bringing people, physicians, nurses, administrators, and policy decision makers to the table to have some good discussions around these pertaining to emergency department operations. So I'm going to, I think that's about all I need to say at this point. Jody, I'll hand it over to you if that's okay, and you can just tell us when to change the slides. Is that okay, Jody?
That sounds wonderful. Thanks, Julian. I really appreciate it. And for everyone on the call, I greatly appreciate you all and me to speak with you today. Unfortunately, this is one of those rare days where all the many jobs I have sort of come together. So I was teaching a lean healthcare course to about 30 people today in Knoxville, and I work the overnight shift tonight at home. So the only way I could kind of work this in is if I arranged my flight so that I could do this during the layover in Atlanta. So I apologize if you hear any backup noise or background noise. Please do accept my apologies. So, but thank you for allowing me to speak. And many of you guys have heard me before to British Columbia on specifically on lean tools. And in the previous discussions we've had, it's centered more around things you can do with lean tools, queuing theory, that sort of thing. And I haven't really got into much about sort of where lean can go wrong. And so I felt like Julie and I talked this over, and we felt like a good thing to talk about today would be just kind of where lean could go wrong if you're not careful in the emergency department specifically. And some of this stuff actually could be sort of more broadly addressed to lean in general, even in manufacturing. Actually, Julian, go ahead 2 slides, please, to number 5, so valuing current state. So, and I'm going to just take what I would consider the top 5 pitfalls of lean in the ED, and I'm going to kind of talk to you guys a little bit about them, and I'm going to go kind of what I consider number 5 up to number 1 are the most important. So the first thing that I consider a significant pitfall when you're applying lean for the emergency department is as a team valuing the current state, or the way we've always done it, over objective analysis. So in other words, essentially taking, looking at objective data, in a certain direction and saying, but, well, we don't think that's true. And this is a common thing that we run into initial for lean implementations, because people don't tend to innately buy into the whole, get a team of people together, you do the analysis, and it's pointing in a certain direction, and the team simply says, well, we don't believe it, so we're not going to do it. And with each of these examples, I'm going to give you some experiences I've had and some kind of emphasize sort of. So this first case is, again, in regards to valuing over objective analysis. And so we were working with a 40,000 visit emergency department trying to fix an issue with a very long wait time, low patient satisfaction. OCD had about 7 arrivals per hour. And for the U.S., probably the average emergency department, this particular ED had low satisfaction and about an average 40% ESI 4 and 5 patients. This ED was staffed with 5 providers at peak time, so 3 physicians and 2 mid-levels. And so when we looked at their sort of arrivals and their staffing by hour a day, so this graph on the left represents their nurse staffing relative to their nurse demand, the demand being in purple, the nurse staffing in blue, and the right graph shows the doc demand relative to the doc staffing. And so when we did the math on this, and a quick way to determine productivity is to simply divide, the daily arrival rate by the total hours of coverage. And so what we did is we looked at 110 arrivals per day. We divide that by 77 hours of physician coverage. And we found that the doctors were their productivity was about 1.42 patients per hour. Now, if I sort of threw that out to most of the people up in Western Canada, they'd say, wow, that's a really low productivity rate for physicians. Most of the Canadian sites that we work with are up in the 2 range, and indeed, probably the U.S. average is, on the low end, is probably 1.6, and the high end 2.2, somewhere around there. So, you know, the question is kind of what should you do? And there's the other element here is that the nurse staffing from a, I think I've got an echo here. Okay, better. So the nurse staffing also only varied by 1 or 2 nurses relative to the day shift relative to the overnight. And that was kind of striking to us because the demand for nurses, there was about a 3-fold difference. I'm still getting some echo, so if anyone has their computer on and their phone on, it's probably feeding back.
Yeah, we're going to try and we'll try and see if we can't mute more lines.
Okay. So the physicians in this particular case were locked into this 1.4 patients per hour was the baseline, and so whatever they experienced relative to this 1.4 patients per hour was going to be a problem. So their fast track and their low acuity flow wasn't optimized, and therefore they couldn't see that there was a better way. And what we, in essence, kind of figured out was that by optimizing their low acuity flow, they could have dropped literally 2 shifts a day. And if they dropped 2 shifts a day, that would have driven their productivity up to 1.8 patients per hour. In other words, they would have been at what I would consider the average for the United States. And that would have saved them about $840,000 a year. So let's say there's 10 docs in their group, that would have been an incremental increase of $80,000 per physician. However, when we did these trials, they just couldn't, the experience with them was that, oh, this is harder than it was before. And I guess my point in this case is that they really couldn't see that what the productivity levels that they were running into at the 1.4 level was really well below what most physicians experience in the emergency medicine world. So they got kind of locked into the way they've always done things. And couldn't sort of understand, hey, if we do implement lean principles, yeah, things are going to be a little bit busier, and that busyness is almost like a relative factor, I would say. Now, the interesting thing about the nurses, again, they only dropped their nurse staffing from their day shift down to their evening shift of 33%, yet their arrival rate dropped by 75%. So in other words, they had an imbalance between the overnight and the day shift in terms of nursing demand, but they had almost level staffing throughout the 24-hour period. Now, this is a common thing that we see in emergency departments. In essence, what happens is you're so used to coming into a wall of patients at 11 o'clock and working through that wall throughout the overnight that you can't sort of envision a different or better way. And it turns out if you do a better job of aligning your daytime staffing relative to the demand coming in, then you can work down that queue so that the queue never exists at 11 o'clock. Now, these particular nurses were unwilling to shift resources to the front end to offload the main ED, again, optimizing the low acuity flow. And in essence, doing this would have emptied their waiting room, so they wouldn't have needed those extra nurses on the overnight shift. So this is a good example of, again, being wed to the way things currently are and not sort of seeing objective data that would tell you sort of otherwise. And I'll give you another really good study here that was another ED we worked with, about a 90,000 visit place, and they were essentially varying their staffing based on their sense of needs and not really kind of using sound operational principles. And they had a significant boarding issue, and their average was about 15 boarders per day during the weekdays. And I'm sorry, Julian, I'm on slide 8, which is case study number 2, and I've just moved to slide 9. So in essence, when we did the analysis, this particular emergency department had level staffing 7 days a week. So they had variation in the night shift relative to the day shift, but they had the same 24-hour coverage 7 days a week. And when we looked at the data showed that indeed they had a 20% volume difference on Saturday, Sunday, relative to all of the other days, just volume, not even including the boarding. So what we also figured out was their boarding issues were primarily weekday boarding issues, which is the case in most hospitals. And what we found there was that if you combine the differential in the workload, when you add the boarding numbers on top of the increased volume numbers, there was really about a 40% difference between, say, Monday, Tuesday, and Saturday, Sunday. And yet they had the same staffing on all those days. So we did some kind of projections, and we said, man, if you just aligned your nurse staffing, just even the total hours in a day, that would have essentially provided an additional 5% of their FTEs, or about 3 FTEs, through better alignment of when their nurses were needed. Slide number 10, Julian. So, and one important thing that we noticed in this analysis, so this, and you should see a chart here that has a baseline on the left, and that baseline represents the hourly nursing staffing that they had by hour of day. Now, on the top, you have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, which is their days of the week, and that was what we had determined objectively were the number of nurses that they needed. And if you go to the next slide, which has the red boxes, so in essence, what we did is we compared their daily staffing with the staffing that they actually needed by hour of day, and what we were able to determine was that they were only exactly matching the patient demand 10% of the time. So the boxes here that are in white simply represent the times they got it right. All of the red boxes here represent all the times they were either over or under. So if you're over or you're under, so if you're over, you have nurses there that aren't really needed. If you're under, you have patients that are waiting, queuing up behind nurses. So what we simply did, and again, next slide, please, Julian, we did the staffing analysis, and what you see here is staffing by hour of day, or sort of demand by hour of day and by day of week. And the red represents your core staffing, like your charge nurse, your triage nurses, that sort of thing. The green represents the demand for nurses relative to the hour of day and the day of week. So the far left of the graph is Saturday. The next bump is Sunday, and then the rest are Monday through Friday. And so the green represents demand for nurses of patients walking in the ED, and the orange on top represents the incremental demand due to holds. So in other words, you're not getting your patients out. These patients are done with the ED. And so as you can see from this profile, the demand between Monday being the peak demand day and the rest of the days is far exceeds the demands for Saturdays and Sundays, yet their staffing was the same. So next slide. So, and this slide represents their current staff. This is by hour of day and by day of week. And this was their current profile that they were using. And notice they were a little bit over on the week on all the overnights. And again, this was compensatory in that they knew they were going to have a bulk of patients kind of hanging around most of the night. And then note how badly they missed Monday, Tuesday, particularly Monday and Tuesday, in that the demand for patients, for nurses, far exceeds the capacity, and that happens early on in the day. So next slide, Julian. So what we did is we created a profile, and this is the green represents the nursing demand. So in other words, they were only at about 17 or 18 nurses on Mondays, and we determined that they needed about 22. Same thing, they were about 18 on Saturdays and Sundays, but they actually needed 16. Same thing with the overnight shift. Notice that, and I'll show you kind of where this goes. So next slide. So and again, the nursing and leadership and frontline nurses were reluctant to change. They said, well, wait a second, we don't really want to change. This is going to be a big problem. They also feared the nursing union. They didn't think the nursing union would really come on board with this. but they eventually decided they had to move forward because they knew there were, they had 8 and 9 patients per nurse at times on Mondays, and they really knew they couldn't kind of do that long term. So next slide. And so what we did is we met with the nurses, and we essentially created this. We talked with them. We tried to understand what their shift profiles would look like. So we interviewed the nurses, and they said, we really like shifts that start at 7, 9, 11, 3, 7, and 9, and 11 p.m. And then we really like shifts that are 12 hours duration, but we'll do some 8 hours, and we'll even do some 4 hours if we have to. And then so we were able to create basically a schedule from that preference list that exactly matched that profile of nurses that we needed. So in other words, we created a schedule by day of week, by hour of day, that would exactly match the demand for patients coming through. Now, next slide. And the interesting thing here is through really careful analysis and objective data, the team realized actually that the new configuration meant fewer nights, fewer weekends, and better shift start and stop time. So we actually ended up creating some 9 to 5 shifts, which didn't exist in their ED, and some 9 to 9 shifts, and those got gobbled up immediately. They were immediately approved. This whole plan was immediately approved by the nursing union. And the final kind of result was an improvement for everybody, improvement for the patients, improvements for the nurses, an improvement in the overall coverage. And now what this chart here represents under this results page, so Julian, we're on the one that says 668 at the bottom. So this again is a representation of day of week at the top and hour of day on the left. And green means you move away and red means you move towards. So in essence what we did is we shift nursing resources from the overnights and from the weekends towards the busier Mondays and Tuesdays and towards the middle kind of hours where they were kind of losing volume. And essentially what this move did is it created, it optimized the nursing staffing. It was equivalent to about 8 FTEs. So in other words, we created 8 FTEs that were otherwise being misutilized. And in this particular hospital, I know this says 668, but it was actually closer to $1 million in savings. So, or I guess $1 million that they didn't have to spend in additional nurses to meet the demand. So next slide. So it's real important, I think, to really kind of use objective data to drive your decision making and allow that to unfreeze your current thinking and the current way you do things. So pitfall number 2 is the underestimation of the value of standardization. And this is one of the, I think, most difficult things that clinical people have to deal with. And this is the hardest thing I think it is for us to teach people. But the value of standardizing your workflow as opposed to letting people just kind of do what they want. Next slide. So in other words, the whole kind of issue here is we want people to, if there's a system, we want a systematized way that patients flow through your system, and we want, where there's decision points, we want rigid or relatively rigid criteria for those decision points. So if you're implementing a RAS, we want strict criteria for who goes where. And if the strict criteria, say, are age-based or chief complaint-based, it's okay to say, okay, these following ages and chief complaints go to the RAS, these don't. But, you know, nurse opinion trumps all. But the problem is most sites don't go through the rigor of creating these standardized pathways and protocols. So, and here's a case study. So we were working with an ED that was entertaining a split flow model, and they wanted to stream patients to a lower acuity area. Now, now they were relying on nurses to determine who goes where as opposed to protocol-based streaming. So as a result, they had an additional X number of patients at peak times were directed towards the main ED, and the system broke down. So in other words, they were relying on nurses who weren't necessarily savvy or weren't experienced in streaming sort of vertical threes to the low acuity area. And so it was really nurse dependent on who would go to the main and who wouldn't. So patients that were clearly not sick, but they were technically level threes would go to the main. They would gobble up main ED beds when they could have easily gone to the low acuity zone. So, and several times we recommended, hey, you just need a protocol, you need a set chief complaints that will enable you to guide that streaming, and they were resistant. Another example of this failure to standardize. So, and this is another ED having a mix of mid-levels and physicians, and they were covering essentially staffing with 24 physician hours and 12 physician assistant hours daily. And all of them had different practice styles. So, and this is something we see all the time. So some order everything, some order nothing. Continually plagued, this particular ED is continually plagued with severe fluctuations in performance. And the way that performance actually gets conveyed is, oh, really killer day today. Oh, this was a terrible day. Or, hey, we had a great day today. And it turns out that, and I'll just give you an example. So let's say you've got a 30,000 visit ED with a peak arrivals of 6 patients per hour. Well, let's say you've got a variation in productivity in your doctors. Say like the low end, let's say, is 1.5 patients per hour, and the high end is 3 patients per hour. Well, you know, as long as you got a couple of the 3 patients per hour, let's say you staff it with 3 docs. Well, as long as you got 3 2 per hour physicians on, you're going to meet demand and everything's going to be fine. But if you happen to get 3 of those 1 per hour, you're only going to be able to see 4.5 patients per hour, and therefore you're going to have an additional 1.5 patients building up every hour of the day. Hold on, please. So in essence, you're obstructing flow of patients just simply based on the productivity levels of the doctors that are showing up, and this happens all over the place in the United States. So, and it's interesting because a lot of nurses will say they can predict what the day will be like before it even comes based on the physician schedule. So pitfall number 3 would be failure to look at the whole value stream with an eye on constraints. So, and what a lot of EDs do is they'll target their work towards where they're feeling the most pain. And it turns out if you don't take a system level perspective on where you're going to focus your efforts, you can get into a lot of trouble. And so it's real important to look at your whole system and say, where are we feeling the pain? And then have a systematized approach to how you're going to solve problems. This obviously involves kind of looking at queuing and understanding where your arrival rates are exceeding your capacity in your demand. So, and once you understand that ED flow is simply a network of queues, then you can look at that network of queues and say, okay, well, one queue is triage. Another queue is beds, providers, and ancillary in the emergency department. Another queue would be waiting for the inpatient side. So once you understand that, you can say, well, where am I feeling the most pain? And in essence, if we understand that that there are bottlenecks and there are non-bottlenecks, we understand that only through working on a bottleneck resource, and I'm sorry again, we are on slide 24, Julian. So it says theory of constraints, 2 types of bottlenecks. So it's only when we kind of understand that we are, when we're working on a true bottleneck, are we going to really impact the system. Next slide. So it turns out that we can only enhance flow when we're working on the bottleneck resource. And working on a non-bottleneck resource is actually not doing any good to the system. This is frequently seen in EDs that say work on the front end when they already have an existing back end problem. So, and this would be seen, so if you have boarding and you're trying to sort of implement a RAS to get more patients through the system, and what you find is that that actually it is all you're doing is optimizing that front end, but it's actually causing more and more patients to try to get through that bottleneck, and that bottleneck is not allowing patients through. So working on an upstream process can actually exacerbate problems in downstream bottlenecks. So local optimization in this sense can hurt the overall system performance. An example of this would be, again, we were working with an ED that saw about 45 patients per year with a 35% admit rate. And they were really struggling with long waits and ICU boarders in particular. But they had boarders, but they were really struggling with their ICU boarders. And so they implemented a system that was essentially like a RAS system. And 14 months later, their volume was up 28%. So in a little over a year, their volume went from 45,000 visits to 55,000 visits. And soon they kind of outstripped their ICU to even accommodate the patients. So they were, you know, before we implemented these changes, EMS kind of knew not to come to this hospital because they were really busy. But once they started opening beds, EMS kind of preferentially chose that hospital. So at the end of this 14-month period, it turns out they were boarding about 7 or 8 ICU patients in the ED, in their 32-bed ED. So boarding is much worse, and their metrics haven't changed at all. Yeah, they've accommodated more volume, but they haven't made the patient experience any better. So next slide. So and number 2 would be, and this is something that we see all the time. Pitfall number 2 would be believing that once you implement lean, you'll never have to add resources. And this is a real big frustrator for me because lots of times we'll work with EDs and they'll do a lot of great work and their volume will increase just like we usually see it. So usually they optimize their ED performance, and then the next thing you know, their ED is overflowing with patients, and they've optimized. Now they need to reproduce, but everybody in the hospital is saying, no, you just need to keep applying lean. Well, lean doesn't mean infinite work out of your people. Lean means reducing waste to levels that are acceptable and then implementing or reproducing these best practices. And so next slide. And so this same site actually that I was just talking about with this 35% admit rate and this 20% uptick. So despite these increases in volume and system optimization, the system was reluctant to add additional staff, despite the fact we were telling them over and over again, your volume's going to increase, your volume's increasing. Well, so they continued to get behind the 8 ball because they weren't believers in the fact that, hey, lean doesn't solve all your problems. I mean, so this is really important. So once you undertake change, make sure everyone knows, boy, if your volume explodes, you can only go so far. And what will happen in these cases is you'll teach your staff, boy, lean is great, and performance improvement in the ED really makes your workplace better. But they'll also learn eventually that if they don't have support from upper administration, performance improvement really doesn't help anything, and they'll learn to not improve. And this is something that's, I think, very serious. The other important kind of caveat to this is if people learn that if they improve, then they'll start losing jobs, then no one's going to want to improve anything. And that's one of these aspects of lean that really does cross over from manufacturing. If lean is seen as a cutting mechanism, then it won't make it in your organization. So the final sort of point here, or what I think is the greatest pitfall with applying lean or any sort of improvement is the next slide, which is lack of leadership. And to me, you can have all the tools you want, you can learn, you can read every book about lean, you can read everything, but if you don't have leadership engagement, then you're not going to succeed, or it'll be very difficult to sustain your efforts. And Julian, I'm on slide 30 now, which says 3 keys for organizational excellence. So I really do kind of firmly believe, and we've experienced this firsthand, we've gone in and worked with organizations that had great leadership and they've taken off. We've gone in with other organizations and we've given them the answers and they're struggles, and they haven't been able to get anything off the ground. And one thing I guess I've learned over the years is that it really takes this hand-in-hand commitment between nursing and physician leadership, and with high-level support from the top of the organization, in order to really, truly make meaningful change that sticks in the emergency department. So we've seen engagements where there's no docs and they kind of struggle. We've seen engagements with lots of docs and they've done great. Most engagements that we're involved in have nursing involvement. And we see similar related to this high-level support. So if you don't have high-level support, your efforts are going to tank. Or you're going to find yourselves kind of going, well, where's the cavalry? So next slide. And just important to understand that leadership can be anyone. It can be nurses, doctors, techs, unit coordinators, VPs. It can be just about anyone. And it's important to understand that leadership is just people that want to take the organization in a different direction. And it's important for you all on the call to understand that if you really want to make really, really significant change in your emergency departments, that you really need to grab onto these leaders and really kind of support them to do what they think needs to be done in the emergency department. So it's identification of these people, it's supporting them, and engaging physicians. Again, you can't do it without physicians, I don't think, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a doc. I'm saying that because I've seen lots of really, really great engineers get nowhere. And I've seen lots of nurses be very frustrated working on processes that get all kind of squashed in one fell swoop because there's no doc engagement. So next slide. So the way you engage doctors is you appeal to the scientists. So, decide on your goals, decide on your metrics, and then make the results transparent. So align your incentives. Make sure that the physicians understand that you are striving towards operational and clinical excellence, and that this is going to make their day easier. But the one thing that a lot of docs don't understand is that you've got to participate, and that might mean not doing a shift here, not doing a shift there. And what we need to convince people is that working on problems now will make things easier in the future, and will make things better for everyone. So. And next slide, we're on slide 33, which says change management. And it's really important to understand, I think, in this whole leadership component that we need to sort of support and engage in change. Everyone should understand that change is very important to the survival of your emergency department. And it's that flexibility and that ability to change that really kind of will make your ED an amazing ED at some point. Next slide, Julian. So it's important to understand also that it's important to embrace change. So you need to change. Your team needs to engage change and change before you have to change. It's often important to look 2 or 3 steps down the line. So we're going to make this change now, and if volume increases then we're going to have to make the next change. And if that happens, then we need to even make the next change. So it's really important to become this learning organization and translate that learning into action. And you need everybody on board for that. Another important sort of issue around leadership, and this is the next slide, don't wait for experience. Don't wait for someone to come in and show you how to do it, or don't not try something just because you don't know how, you've never done it before. A lot of my experience early on was gained just by showing up and trying things, and I think that's as important as anything else, is just kind of showing up, trying something new and different, and spreading that those rapid cycle tests throughout your organization. Next slide, Julian. So, and again, so we've talked about the significance of leadership, and this leadership actually comes all the way to the top as well. So you've got to have support up the chain in order for lean transformations to be successful. But without the support, you're simply optimizing the ED performance, and you may be doing it at the expense of some other departments. you may also lose momentum over time if you're not careful, because again, you might not have the resources you need to sustain the change that you're trying to undergo. So, and I've seen this as well, where good teams, they've come to our IHI conferences, or they've come to University of Tennessee, and they have these great ideas, and they go home and they say, yeah, we tried it, but we didn't really have the support of the organization, so it kind of fell flat on its face. It's really, really important that that we do, engage upper level management, or they engage the staff at the front lines. You can't do it alone. You've got to have both arms of the equation. You have to have high level support. You have to have frontline engagement and leadership, and you really have to sort of partner in this journey. And next slide. So, and this is one thing I've learned over the years is that this kind of race for quality is a never-ending journey, and that it really, if I could look back and say 10 years ago when I started this stuff, that I'd be doing this for as long as I've been doing it, I would have said, you're crazy, I'm an ER doc, I think in minutes. But the truth is, this is an endless journey. So there's the problems and the impact of the problems never stop. So it's your goal to go out there, assume leadership roles and positions, engage upper level and frontline folks, and to kind of get this ball rolling. So, Julian, the last slide here, just a summary. So, again, if any of you guys have tried lean, you've had struggles, you've had problems or issues, they really kind of, most of them boil down to one of these 5 points. Again, not trusting objective data, not looking at the whole value stream and making sure you're targeting the right elements. And I've actually got a typo here, but also making sure that sorry.
No, it wasn't us.
Yeah, so just making sure, or underestimating the value of standardization. Failure to look at the whole value stream without any constraints. And then, again, this false belief that once you've implemented lean, you'll never have to add resources. And then finally, just leadership is so critical in moving any organization. I don't care if it's ED, I don't care if it's a hospital, I don't care if it's GM. Leadership is critical, and having that vision of where to be and then having the mechanism to get your folks there is just critically important. So with that, I think, Julian, we're at like 2:41 Eastern time, so that would be 11:41 your time. I'm happy to sort of pull up and answer any questions that anybody has if you want to open it up.
Thank you very much, Jody. That was excellent, and I really do appreciate you doing this from the airport on the run. I don't know what time you're please, but hopefully you'll have a few minutes. What we've got is your line is the one, and our line here is the only ones that are actually unmuted. And what we'll ask is anybody who has a question, if you could push the icon at the lower part of the participants panel. It's on the left-hand side there. And if you raise your hand, we'll see it, and we can unmute you, and you can ask your question. And if you wish to, you can also send an email or a chat message, and we'll read it out as well. So while people are thinking about that, I just wanted to, first of all, thank you again, and I want to ask you in your graphs around the actual supply and demand, demand from patient volumes, and the ability to match that with staffing. Have you found that there's a common sort of distribution, or is it pretty much each emergency department has to look at their own situation? Or can you sort of say that, Mondays are going to be busy, Friday nights are going to be busy, and once we know that, we can sort of figure out from there. How would you do it if you're an individual site?
Yeah, so what we commonly find is there's a few patterns. and the general understanding, at least in ED circles, is that that Mondays are busy. So Mondays are usually the highest volume days in just about every ED I've been to. And then that's complicated by the fact that they're usually higher acuity days as well. So if you had 100 patients coming in on a Monday and 100 patients coming in on a Saturday, all other things being equal, the Saturday would feel much easier than that Monday, because Monday's higher admit rate, it's a higher acuity level. Saturdays are kind of more of the kind of minor traumas and lacerations and people that just don't have doctors open on the weekend, so you tend to get lower acuity stuff. So, but what we normally see is sort of a predominance of volume on Monday, Tuesdays that's really sicker than you would expect, and then Sundays usually it's usually a toss-up between Sunday and Wednesday, and then usually the Thursday, Friday, Saturdays are kind of the lighter days. Some sites we've seen Thursday has a peak, and not really sure the origins of that. Now, as far as hour of the day, usually that curve kind of looks the same just about anywhere. It's funny, in Canadian EDs, I've actually seen the volume sort of trails off on the evenings a little bit more dramatically than it does in the U.S. And then the other kind of notable exception is pediatric EDs. So I don't know if there's any pediatric EDs on the phone, but pediatric EDs tend to have really, really exaggeratedly high volumes on Sundays, and then their weekdays tend to be relatively flat, but their weeknights are real killers. So those are sort of real opportunities there for aligning demand and capacity. And then the other thing I'll say, just common pitfalls or things, we very frequently see lag or not in the ramp up. So in other words, we bring our staff in too late. In essence, we just kind of learn that whenever we feel the pain is when we tend to add staff. So that's typically about 2 or 3 hours later than when the volume arrives, is what we typically see. And then we typically see a lack of appreciation for earlier on in the week in terms of staffing, and then also the overnight tends to be exaggerated for that exact reason I told you, is because people just need to be prepared for that day when things don't work out well and that overage is still into the night. So that's what we usually see.
Excellent. Thank you, Jody. We have a couple questions that's come through on the chat box. So the first one I'll read out, Lannon DeBest, his question is, in looking at the supply versus demand, how do you accommodate the fluctuating acuity of incoming patients? Looking at pure numbers doesn't seem to account for needing extra nursing resources for the trauma example.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that acuity mix actually is a big deal as well. So what we typically do is we will assign varying levels of productivity, or so we'll break it out by CTAS level, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5s, and we'll assign a productivity level to each of those independently. And so, if you can see 3 level 5s an hour, then, on average, you're spending 20 minutes on each of those patients. But if you can only see really like 1 level 2 an hour, then you're spending an hour on those patients. And so what we do is we profile the demand based on CTAS level. And that also allows us to sort of make some judgments over kind of PA, how many PAs do you need relative to how many doctors do you need, for instance. So if you say, well, our PAs see, our physician assistants see CTAS 5s, 4s, and some, 25% of the level 3s. Well, then we can profile how many physician assistants we need relative to how many doctors we need. And I know you guys don't use PAs that much. You're more kind of getting into nurse practitioners and that sort of thing, but same sort of rationale there. It's a great question.
Great, thank you, Jody. From now on, I'll just read out the question. I won't identify who it is. So if you wish to ask a question anonymously, I'll take the blame for it. We actually have a question from Eric Rastein, so we'll unmute you. I think you're next, and then I'll come back to the next chat question. Okay, Eric, you're unmuted. Please ask your question.
Jody, very interesting talk. Another manpower kind of question. Can you speak about the experience you've had in other sites that you've been involved with have had, looking at the use of an on-call roster in the emergency department. You know, typically emergency physicians go into emergency medicine so they don't have to take call, but calling physicians in is a way to deal with those surges in volume and stresses in the department. Same with nurses, if you can answer both the physician part and the nurse part. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think this call question is really, really fascinating, and I'll just give you my 2 cents on it, and I've thought about this a lot, actually. First of all, you know, a true sort of surge-related call, it should really be done with a lot of forethought, because on the one hand, it allows you to deal with some very difficult times or some really extenuating circumstances or very odd presentations for your emergency department. So it allows you to deal with that overflow. Now, the problem is there's several issues related to how you would structure a call program. So there's one element that just says, hey, man, we're going to implement a call program, and every time we're, you know, the ED is falling apart, we're going to call in the doc. Now, if your ED is not, if you haven't gone through all the steps of demand capacity matching and streamlining your processes, and if you're chronically understaffed across the board, well, these call programs end up just being, you know you're coming in, so why even make it a call program? So that's one element, is call does not replace good, sound operational management of your department. Now, number two, I've seen programs, and this is, I've only seen this in the nursing component at this point, but there, you know, call frequently, you get a base pay for your call, and then if you're called in, you get, you know, regular plus 20% or something like that. So most of the call programs are, you get a baseline for your call, and then you get paid a little bit extra if you come in. Well, we actually implemented a program like that in our emergency department, and what our nurses were doing were kind of gaming the system. So they would call out, and then somebody else would come in on call, and so all it did was kind of restructure who was coming in and made it a little bit more random and made us pay more money for our overall staffing. So some people do actually end up gaming call systems. The third point I'd make about call is that it's really important to understand that if your ED is out of control, you should identify the root cause of that. So, and what I see over and over again is, hey, we need to call in the doc. Well, you don't necessarily need to call in the doc. And I'll give you an example. So let's say your ED is falling apart, and it's because you're short nurses. And let's say, you know, like you're not really badly short nurses, but let's say you're short a couple nurses. And let's say you got 2 doctors working with 8 nurses. Well, if you call in another doc, if your answer is call in a doc, well, what's that doc going to do? That doc's actually going to come in. They're going to need some nurses to work with, so those 4 nurses for the 2 existing docs are going to go down to maybe 3 nurses for those 2 existing docs, and you're going to have 2. So all you're going to have is some supported physicians all around. So you're actually going to be robbing from Peter to pay Paul there. And you haven't fixed the underlying cause, which is the shortage in nurses, for instance. So also, you can call in all the call teams you want in the world, but if you don't have a mechanism to deal with patients who don't have access to beds, for instance, like let's say you got a bed blocking problem upstairs, you can call in all the people you want. That's not going to solve that problem. So my recommendation is if you're considering making up a call schedule and really truly calling people in, you need several elements. One, you need to do your homework on your baseline so that you're not calling people in every day. Number 2, when you call people in, it's got to be a team of people. So it's got to be doctors, nurses, and they have to have a location to treat patients. And I don't care where that location is, but it's got to be at least a handful of beds. It's got to be a doctor and whatever ratio you use, so 1 doctor, 2 nurses, whatever. But the team comes in to offload the department for some period of time, and then they go home. And there should be very clear triggers. It shouldn't be subjective. It should be if X, Y, and Z criteria are met, then we call in the on-call person. But call's a real tricky thing, but that's my thought on it.
Great, thank you, Jody. Eric, do you have a follow-up question to that or comment?
No, just that you know, we're thinking of doing this, and that the things that you are mentioning are things that I've jotted down. The things that I think are important too. I appreciate the comment about the need for a place to put the physician and the patients that.
Eric. So Jody, the next question, if you got time, Jody?
Yeah, sure do.
Okay. Next question is, how difficult was it to convince the nurses and the union to accept changes in nurse staffing patterns?
You know, I personally have never had a problem with unions in any place I've worked as a consultant. And I'll just tell you, once, you know, if you just walk in and say, hey, we want to change a bunch of shifts, then you're going to have problems. But if you walk in with the objective data that says, here's what we want to do, and here's the plan, and here's what we expect to see out of it, I think as long as there's kind of real good evidence, and the issues are what the issues are, most of the time you're probably going to not meet that much resistance. And we've done plenty of these engagements with unionized shops, and really when you bring everybody together, like, and this is just my end of one person who's maybe worked with a few EDs, I tend to think if you bring everybody together, you make them all part of the solution, then the barriers are going to be dropping down a bit. Are you going to have to navigate some legal stuff? Sure. But people are people. Nurses work in EDs and they want to see them get better. So you know, I haven't really had much problem with nursing unions, to be quite frank, but I know other people have. But my suggestion, whenever you're kind of going up against things that you think are going to be challenges, just make sure you have everything as objective as possible, so you can speak about the issues, not about sort of things that end up being politics.
All right, we're entering political season here with a lot of renegotiations of contracts here, so we're going to get a lot of that in a few months, I'm sure. It's already started. I have a question here from James Chan. Hi, James. James from Prince George. His question is related to local optimization versus system optimization. We have implemented a RAS unit, a rapid assessment zone, and have increased throughput with mid-level acuity, which helps with the wait room queue. The bigger picture, though, which is boarding, is much harder to address, and we're working on it. Doesn't it help to do RAS in order to segment patients in addition to trying to deal with the larger problem of boarding? And I guess a sub-question to that, or a follow-up, is can you give a different example of how working on smaller constraints negatively impact the entire system?
Sure. So let's say, and it all kind of comes back to, I think, when you sort of speed up an upstream process that is upstream from a bottleneck, you run the risk of further congesting all the sort of the places to keep work in process upstream from that bottleneck. So what I mean is, if there's a constraint somewhere, and let's say that constraint is actually the physician in the ED, and let's say you're just understaffed and you won't admit it. Well, you can do all of the improvement work you want around triage. You can eliminate triage, and all that will do is gobble up all of the beds in your ED as quickly as possible. And so in that case, I mean, I think that's a really good example of how if you're not addressing the true constraint, you know, you could eliminate triage, and all you can do is fill up your bed so that now you can't take rescue squads anymore. So if you're not addressing that true constraint, and there's others, you know, if radiology is a serious bottleneck for you, and you're cranking through these patients, I mean, again, the good news is you're getting them seen, but the bad news is in doing so, you could actually be further constraining your ability to see patients. So, and I lived through this in the early 2000s when we moved into our new ED. We didn't deal with the upstream bottleneck of the inpatient side effectively, and we essentially had 25 of our 50 ED beds were held with boarders. So in essence, we had half the capacity. And what that did was it consumed about half of our nursing resources. So that further compounded sort of the ED flow problem. So my message would be, yeah, I think the right answer is to get patients from the box. Implementing RAS is the right thing for ED patients, but you have to understand that in doing so, you have to deal with the other countermeasures for problems that you're experiencing. So you need to have buy-in. If you can't get patients out of the ED, you better staff those patients that are in the ED with ED nurses. Otherwise, as you build more borders, you're going to further limit your ability to see patients. So in essence, if you look at the whole entire system, and this is Ellie Goldrat's theory of constraint, if you look at the whole system, you want to make sure you're focusing on the key bottlenecks. And any of you guys who have heard my other operational talks, I do firmly believe that you need to work on things you have control over, but I also think you need to be out there speaking and engaging help from other sides of the hospital once you've started your journey. So if you're at the point where you've started a RAS unit and you're really kind of optimizing front-end flow, then I think you should be out there crusading for help and involvement on the back end.
Looks like we've run out of time. So again, thank you very much for doing this, Jody, on the situation you're in terms of catching the flight. I'm very impressed, and so thank you again. That was an excellent talk as always, and we'll certainly look forward to connecting with you in the future. Have a safe trip on your flight, and thank you everybody for your attention, and also for putting up with some of the workarounds we did with the slides, and I think it came together very nicely. Again, we have recorded this, and we're going to be putting it up on the Evidence to Excellence website in the next week or so, and so you can listen to parts of it again as you wish. And the other part is the next webinar will be replaced by the WEDOC, Western Emergency Department Operations Conference. So if you liked what you heard in the last few webinars, please consider joining us on April 27th and 28th here in Vancouver. It's through the UBC.
Julian, you there?
Yep.
Oh, okay. So just want to say thank you, everyone, and I appreciate inviting me to talk, and I apologize if there's any background noise, but I really enjoyed it, and I hope you guys did too. Thanks. Take care.
Take care, everybody.